This committee will come to order. We'll ask all the members to take their seat at this time. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 4 bipartisan measures, and without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit any statements or extraneous material on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider these measures today en bloc, and so without objection, the following items previously provided to members and also in your packets will be considered en bloc and are considered as read. We start with H.R. 4681, the No Assistance for Assad Act, with Royce Amendment 94 in the nature of a substitute and Royce Amendment 99. Next is H.R. 4744, the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act, with McCall Amendment 91 in the nature of a substitute, Cicilline Amendment 129, and Poe Amendment 79. Then House Resolution 644, strongly condemning the slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya, Royce Amendment 95 in the nature of a substitute to that, and House Concurrent Resolution 111, supporting efforts to bring the 2026 FIFA World Cup competition to Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And I now recognize myself to speak on today's business. We begin by considering H.R. 4744. This is the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. And I want to thank Chairman McCall and also Representative Deutsch for authoring this important legislation. For years, the regime in Tehran has squashed all opposition in Iran with excruciatingly brutal tactics, including torture in Evin prison and in other prisons across Iran, and including mass executions. Yet very few Iranian government officials have been designated for human rights violations. The head of the regime's judiciary was not designated specifically for human rights abuses until last December. This is the same Iranian regime that is holding American citizens, including one who was in very poor health, on sham charges in one of the largest ransom schemes ever devised. It is far past time that the regime face consequences for its attacks on Americans and attacks on Iranians alike. The legislation we are considering today does just that. Next, we consider H.R. 4681. This is the No Assistance for Assad Act. I thank Ranking Member Engel and Representative Kinzinger for their work on this important bill, and it will help keep U.S. taxpayer money out of the hands of the murderous Assad regime and out of the hands of Assad's proxies. While the U.S. is, of course, sensitive to the humanitarian needs of Syrians living in devastated areas, and we remain, by the way, the single largest donor for emergency assistance, while we're concerned about all of that, we should not be responsible for rebuilding areas controlled by the Assad regime, controlled by Iran or Russia, Hezbollah, or Iranian-backed militias. It would be unconscionable to give money and resources, which would likely be siphoned off by corrupt officials, to the Assad regime while the Syrian people continue to suffer chemical weapons attacks and rocket bombardment and continue to suffer starvation. So next, I want to thank Representative Karen Bass for introducing House Resolution 644, strongly condemning the slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya. Since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, Libya has been rocked by chaos. Shamefully, the resulting power vacuum has led to the expansion of terrorist groups that are heavily involved in criminal activities, including human trafficking. There have been multiple disturbing reports of serious abuses of migrants and refugees in Libya treated as slaves, including reports of slave auctions. This resolution condemns those horrific abuses. And finally, we have House Concurrent Resolution 111, supporting the efforts of the United States Committee to bring the 2026 World Cup competition to Canada, to Mexico, and to the United States. The U.S. has not hosted an IFA World Cup event since 1994, when we hosted games throughout 9 cities and drew a record attendance of 1.3, I think the attendance is 3.6 million, a record that remains unbroken today. Hosting in 2026 would bring billions of dollars to the U.S., and we already have the necessary infrastructure, such as the stadiums and training facilities. This resolution rightly recognizes that we do a great job hosting this highly anticipated international event. So I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Engel of New York, for his remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this markup. We have 4 good measures before us today. I'm glad to support them all, and I thank all our members on both sides always for their hard work. But before I get to these 4 items, I have to say, in my view, we need to consider additional sanctions against Russia for its ongoing attack on American democracy. The Chairman and I worked together to get the big sanctions bill across the finish line last year, and we want to see it implemented. So I hope we'll soon consider another bill that I introduced with Mr. Connolly, the Secure Our Democracy Act. It would specifically sanction anyone who interferes with an American election from overseas. I think we need to do whatever it takes. And if the administration won't do it, it's up to us. And I want to thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for bringing forward the No Assistance for Assad Act, which I introduced at the end of last year. I'm grateful for your support as a co-sponsor, along with that of Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Boyle. The Assad regime's brutal campaign of violence wages on. It's just horrific. It's a loss of innocent life. We saw it in Aleppo, in Madaya, and now in eastern Ghouta. People are transmitting their goodbyes to their loved ones as they live under intense bombardment. The regime is using chemical weapons again. Children are suffocating, and silence from the international community. As we continue to work to find some way to end the bloodshed, we also need to start thinking about what will come down the road. This bill says that American assistance for reconstruction should be available in areas controlled by Assad only if the regime stops indiscriminate use of weapons, only if the regime ends attacks on civilians and civilian facilities. This bill says that money can only flow if the regime releases political prisoners, allows human rights organizations access to the prisons, and removes senior officials complicit in human rights abuses. There's a number of other benchmarks as well, moving toward free and fair elections and an independent judiciary, minimizing reliance on Iran, allowing the safe return of refugees. These limitations won't affect locally administered projects. They won't affect humanitarian assistance. Recovery in Syria will be a slow and painful process, but we cannot allow those responsible for hundreds of thousands of murders to control American dollars meant to help the country rebuild. I'm grateful for the bipartisan support this bill has already received, and I ask all members to support moving it forward today. Let me thank next Mr. McCall, the Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee and one of our good members of this committee, and Mr. Deutsch for offering their bill to expand sanctions on Iran as it relates to taking American citizens prisoner. We all know Iran's human rights record is just atrocious. Torture and brutal punishment are the norm. Iran has a record of extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances like the 1988 massacre. Human rights advocates, political dissidents, and journalists are regular targets of the regime. And of course, Iran continues to detain American citizens, notably Siamak and Bakir Namazi, Siamak and Bakir Namazi, and Shia Wang. This bill would expand on existing human rights sanctions in a way that doesn't affect American obligations under the nuclear deal. So I'm glad to support this bill. I'm also grateful to Representative Bass for her resolution condemning the disgusting slave auctions taking place in Libya. Libya has become a transit hub for migrants moving north to Europe, with as many as 1 million refugees and migrants, mostly from sub-Saharan Africa, currently in the country. In the absence of effective government, these vulnerable men and women have been brutally exploited as human trafficking victims, sold at auction, and forced to work for no pay. Can you imagine in 2018 this is still happening? So this measure condemns this horrible practice and calls upon authorities in Libya to put a quick stop to this practice. And finally, I'm glad to support Representative LaHood's concurrent resolution supporting the United Bid Committee's work to bring the 2026 FIFA World Cup to Canada, Mexico, and the United States at a time when the administration has been trampling on our relations with our northern and southern neighbors. I'm glad that Congress continues to see the importance of these ties. Bringing the World Cup back to the United States would be a boon for host cities and allow us, along with our Canadian and Mexican neighbors, to set the standards on hosting this tournament, which will expand from 32 to 48 teams in 2026. I support this resolution, along with the other measures we're considering today. I again thank all our members on both sides, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your leadership on all of the issues today. I support all four of these amendments. I would like to just note about the Libya amendment, which I support, what you're proposing today. But let's just note that the United States had an agreement, and we had set down a plan with Gaddafi when he was in power. And he was a brutal dictator, but he was not permitting the radical Islamic activities that now plague the entire Middle East. We broke our word to Gaddafi. We broke our word to other parties who were part of that agreement. Had we not done so, yes, Libya would still be a dictatorship, but they would not. But you wouldn't have radical Islamicists selling young girls into slavery. And so with that said, when we intervene in order to cleanse an area of dictatorship, as we did with Saddam Hussein, which again turned out to be a catastrophe for the people there, we need to think twice before we get ourselves embroiled trying to get rid of a dictator, because we don't know who that dictator will be replaced by. Although, with that said, I strongly support this because we are condemning the sale of women into slavery by these radical Islamicists there who now control large hunks of Libya. Support, of course, your no assistance to Assad, your human rights, especially the human rights provisions you have in 4744, when we're talking about the people of Iran who are struggling now for their own freedom. And they are courageous people, and they are being met with the utmost brutality. And this message will get to the mullahs in Iran. And also, more importantly, it will go to the people themselves who are struggling there for freedom, and we are on their side. Thank you very much. I support all of the initiatives being proposed today.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. We go now to, I think, Mr. Ted Deutsch of Florida is next in the queue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to express my support for all of the measures before us today as the World Cup approaches, sadly, without the participation of the United States. I support efforts to bring the World Cup to North America. I appreciate the efforts of Representative Bass to bring attention and condemnation to the shocking slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya. And I'm heartened to see us take up H.R. 4681, the No Assistance for Assad Act, as we mark the 7th anniversary of the Syrian conflict. The Assad government is among the most corrupt, brutal, and oppressive regimes the world has ever seen. The destruction wrought by Assad's cluster munitions, his barrel bombs, his use of chemical weapons, and indiscriminate targeting, in addition to the damage caused in the counter-ISIS fight, will plague Syria for decades to come. Millions of innocent civilians are in need of humanitarian assistance. Even when the fighting ends, it will be years before we begin a real discussion about tangible reconstruction. But as we look toward that day, it's important to balance our hope of stability in Syria to allow for humanitarian improvements and refugee returns without providing assistance to the tyrannical regime and, by extension, to the Iranians and Russian interests. This bill is reflective of our values on human rights, international law, and democracy, and it will ensure that Assad does not benefit from post-conflict stabilization efforts. I thank Ranking Member Engel, Congressman Kinzinger, Chairman Royce, and Congressman Boyle for authoring this important legislation. Today, we also have before us H.R. 4474, the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. I am proud to have co-authored this bill with Congressman McCall, and I thank him for his support for all those who have been affected by the Iranian regime's egregious disregard for the human rights of its own people and of American citizens. As members of this committee well know, my constituent Robert Levinson went missing in Iran on March 9th, 2007. Bob is a husband to his wife of over 40 years, Christine. He is a father to his 7 children. He is a grandfather who has never had the chance to meet 5 of his 6 grandchildren. Last week, the Levinson family was forced to mark the 11th year without their husband, their father, and their grandfather. Bob's youngest son, Doug, is here today. Many of you heard from Doug last year when he testified in the Middle East Subcommittee alongside the son of Nizar Zaka and the son and brother of Bakr and Siamak Namazi, 3 others who have been unjustly detained by Iran. For the 8 years that I've served in Congress, I have spoken out about Iran's past commitments to help locate and return Bob. In fact, in January 2016, President Obama, speaking from the White House, announced that Iran had agreed to deepen cooperation in Bob's case. But last week, a spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry denied that Iran had ever committed to help. This is an outrageous lie, and Iran must be publicly called out for this lie. I raise this to illustrate why this bill is so important. The Iranian regime has no regard for human rights or for international law. It systematically represses its own people using technology to censor information, to track and monitor its citizens. It violently represses political dissent. It persecutes religious minorities like the Baha'is. It jails people without due process. It has one of the highest execution rates in the world. And it takes Americans and other foreign nationals hostage. We can say they've been detained. We can say that they're imprisoned. But let's be clear. This is hostage-taking. This bill has nothing to do with Iran's nuclear program. It has nothing to do with the JCPOA. We are not undermining the deal by acting today. We are simply making clear that American citizens will not be used as leverage or bargaining chips. We are making abundantly clear that this Congress stands for human rights. We stand against brutal authoritarian regimes. We stand for the Americans who are being held in Iran. We cannot tolerate Iran's abuses, and every responsible nation should join the United States in condemning these despicable practices. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, I thank you for your support on this bill and for the support that this committee has provided to the Levinsons and to the families of all of those being held in Iran. I hope and pray that this is the last time that I have to tell Bob's story, because it is well past time to bring Bob home to his family. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
We hope so as well, Mr. Deutsch. We go now to Mr. Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, for holding today's markup, including my bill to hold the Iranian regime accountable. I introduced the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act with Mr. Deutsch, who's just spoken on this very eloquently, and I'm grateful to have your support. The Iranian regime continues to perpetrate gross human rights abuses against its own people. They continue to suppress the country's voices for reform through censorship of the media. They continue to recklessly use the nation's resources to expand its regional influence through its support for terrorist organizations. They continue to engage in corrupt practices, and they continue to illegally detain and imprison our citizens without just cause or reason. This is simply unacceptable. Mr. Chairman, this bill serves as a clear signal to the people of Iran that we support them in their quest for freedom. My bill shines a light on the regime's human rights violations and sanctions those who are complicit in such crimes. The same goes for Iranian officials guilty of corruption, censorship, and the diversion of goods intended for the Iranian people. Finally, my bill sanctions individuals complicit in taking Americans and other nations' citizens hostage, and requires the President to work with our international partners to develop a strategy to put an end to this inhumane practice. We have 5 Americans currently detained in Iran. That's intolerable. We must do all we can and apply as much pressure on Iran as necessary to ensure their safe release and prevent future Americans from being held hostage by this brutal regime. I want to again thank the chairman, ranking member, Mr. Deutsch, for your leadership on this committee to hold Iran's officials accountable. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. We go to Congresswoman Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel. In November 2017, CNN broke a story about modern-day slavery in Libya with a grainy video that shows an auctioneer standing in front of a group of young men shouting, "Big, strong boys for farm work." $400, $700, $800. The video left people shocked and sparked protests outside of Libyan embassies here in the U.S. and across Africa and Europe. In December 2016, the UN Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that many migrants in Libya are forced to work for no pay on farms as domestic workers, construction, and road paving workers. And in April 2017, the International Organization for Migration gathered evidence and issued a warning about slave markets in Libya. While there were many warning signs from various international organizations that migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers were suffering abuse, it took actual video evidence for the world to pay attention. Libya has become a primary transit hub for migrants and refugees attempting to reach southern Europe by sea, and the UN estimates that there are now between 700,000 and 1 million migrants and refugees in the country. How did we get here, and what is the solution to the crisis? The fall of Muammar Gaddafi, in which the U.S. participated, as my colleague on the other side of the aisle acknowledged, led to significant political turmoil and insecurity within Libya. Since then, there has been no effective government in place in the country. The internationally recognized Government of National Accord controls some parts of the country, but other political actors control other parts, and there are numerous ungoverned zones across that vast country. This resolution not only strongly condemns slave auctions and the exploitation of migrants and refugees as forced laborers in Libya, it also calls upon all parties to the conflict, including parties to the Libyan political agreement, to investigate and eradicate the auctions, hold those identified in investigation accountable in courts of law, manage the migration flows and migration detention centers in a humane manner, and investigate how funds earned through the transfer, sale, and exploitation of migrants are used and the extent to which such profits are fueling and prolonging Libya's civil conflict. We're also calling upon the United Nations to investigate allegations of the slave trade and other forced labor in Libya, and advocate that all parties to the conflict in Libya allow the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to regularly monitor and publicly report on the situation of all refugees and migrants, including those in detention centers. In addition to what is called for in the resolution, the bottom line, of course, is that slavery is a crime against humanity, and we cannot sit idly by while people around the world are exploited. These auctions expose the interconnected and complex nature of this crisis, and any solution to this problem will require a holistic and comprehensive strategy for Libya and the sending countries across Africa that promotes democratic governance and rule of law, human rights, and creating economic opportunities. The United States must remain focused and continue to promote U.S. values around the world that includes speaking out publicly when we see human rights abuses. But in order to do this, we also need a fully staffed and funded State Department and USAID so that we can remain focused on these issues. We need to join with the international community to address the reasons behind the migrant crisis, the instability of the countries where the migrants were fleeing from in the first place, as well as the international community joining together to assist Libya in addressing this crisis. Thank you, and I yield back.
Mr. Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank the chairman. I'm proud to support H.R. 4744, the Iranian Human Rights and Hostage Take and Accountability Act, introduced by Representatives McCall and Deutsch. Thank them for that. Mr. Chairman, the mullahs in Tehran are among the world's worst human rights abusers. They almost take joy in hurting people of their own country. This year, we've witnessed their brutality again on display as they crushed political dissident from their own people, and they did it in a very violent and brutal way. International tension has faded, but the Iranian people are still in the streets demanding that their rights be protected, whether it be economic opportunity, access to water, religious freedom, or gender equality. The United States should support these dissidents in Iran and Iranians throughout the world that are trying to have a regime change in their own country. In response to these dissidents, the regime has murdered dozens and locked up thousands, as it has done many times before, without any punishment from the outside world. To that end, I'm introducing my amendment, H.R. 4744, to address the regime's past sins, sins that Iran has refused to admit or be held accountable for. Specifically, my amendment calls for investigations of past crimes, such as the 1988 massacre, where thousands of political prisoners were systematically murdered by the regime. Some estimates are over 30,000 were murdered in the streets in 1988. These barbaric mass executions by public hanging, firing squads, including of teenagers, pregnant women who refused to renounce their political affiliation, including many from the MEK, today's leading Iranian dissident group. It's important to remember who exactly were the victims of this bloody massacre. Iranian security officials would ask detainees, "What is your political affiliation?" And those who said the MEK would be immediately placed on execution list to meet their date with the hangman. Mr. Chairman, some of the friends of those that were killed in 1988 in this horrific massacre are here today with us. So horrific was the act that the deputy to Iran's ruler at the time, Ayatollah Khomeini, called it, quote, "the greatest crime committed during the Islamic Republic for which history will condemn us." Well, today is the day of reckoning. It's taken 30 years to condemn Iran for the murder of 30,000 political dissidents, the MEK, and it's time that we adopt this amendment. My amendment urges our government to work with international partners to investigate other major human rights abuses, such as the dozens that were killed in 1999, 2009, and in 2017. In all cases, the families of those murdered by the regime were never told what happened to their loved ones' remains. This amendment demands pressure on the Iranian government to disclose where the final resting place is of the missing so their families may have some peace. I want to thank Mr. McCall and Mr. Engel and Mr. Deutsch for this legislation. I also want to mention 644, the slave auctions in Libya. I want to reiterate that the United States needs to be very careful when it goes into a nation self-righteously overthrowing the government and walking away. That's exactly what happened in Libya. Now we have a failed state that is involved in human sex trafficking, slavery of migrants. Many of those coming from West Africa go to Libya hoping to get a better life in Europe, and they end up on the slave trade block. So I want to commend Representative Bass for this resolution. Human trafficking, modern-day slavery is taking place in many places in the world, but it's taking place at its worst in Libya. It's estimated that at least there are 500,000 to 1 million migrants bottled up in Libya that could be fodder for this slave trade. Evil men, whether they be criminal opportunists or terrorists, are subjugating those in most need for profit, and you cannot put a price on human life. The fact remains that we simply do not know enough about what is going on in Libya today, and we need to get to the bottom of this sex slave trade that is taking place in North Africa. And I want to emphasize once again, the United States needs to be careful before it goes into a nation and self-righteously overthrows the government, because there are consequences. One of those consequences is the slave trade in Libya. I'll yield back to the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. We go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman Royce and Ranking Member Engel, for holding this markup today as we consider important legislation that will help punish Iranian human rights abuses, ensure American funds do not support the Assad regime, oppose the abhorrent slave trade in Libya, and I hope bring the World Cup to North America. I'm proud to support and co-sponsor each of these bills today. Thank you to Mr. McCall and Mr. Engel for introducing H.R. 4744, the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. This legislation expands sanctions that already exist against Iranian human rights abusers to ensure that people who target American citizens or legal permanent residents for abuse, detention, or harassment will face repercussions. I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member, members of this committee, for supporting my amendment to this legislation, which simply extends this sanctionable activity to include actions taken against American citizens or legal permanent residents, regardless of where they take place. This bill is an important expansion of sanctions authority in order to target the Iranian regime to discourage its widespread human rights abuses, which have continued unabated since the signing of the JCPOA. Many members of this committee, including myself, supported the JCPOA in the belief that in order to properly deal with the Iranian regime's support of terror worldwide and crimes against its own people, we must deal with the nuclear question first. This legislation will send a clear message to the Iranian regime and those who support it that the United States is serious about combating Iran's continued aggression within Iran and throughout the region. Today, we know that Iranian troops and Iranian-backed militias are active throughout the region, including in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Gaza, and Yemen. If Iranians associated with these activities commit abuses against Americans, we will now have one more tool to use to punish and hopefully discourage such behavior. I, too, want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Levinson's son and thank Mr. Deutsch for his passionate and sustained efforts to bring attention to the outrageous behavior by the Iranian regime and to secure Mr. Levinson's return. I'll close by saying that I remain strongly committed to the implementation of the Iran nuclear agreement. We're able to bring such strong actions to bear against Iran precisely because we have the nuclear framework in place. I hope the President understands that if we walk away from the Iran deal now, Iran will have nothing stopping it from pursuing a nuclear weapon. This is simply a risk we cannot take. I'd also like to express my support for Congresswoman Bass's resolution H.R. 644, which strongly condemns the slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya. The U.S. should not sit silently while desperate and traumatized people fleeing violence and seeking salvation are victimized through enslavement, forced detention, and physical and sexual violence. It's imperative that the sale and exploitation of human beings for profit be eradicated and that those responsible be held fully accountable. The United States, working in collaboration with the international community, should do everything in our power to assist, and for that reason, I'm proud to support H.Res. 644. I'm also glad to support H.R. 4681, No Assistance for Assad Act, and thank Ranking Member Engel for his leadership in introducing this legislation. Since 2001, the Syrian people have witnessed destruction, violence, and a shocking disregard for their fundamental human rights. Our policy of foreign assistance for Syria must focus on early recovery, reconstruction, and stabilization for a democratic, non-Assad-led Syrian nation. We must ensure that American money does not in any way support the murderous Assad regime, and implementation of this bill will do just that. The actions required of the government of Syria by this legislation would make a substantial step forward in a safer, more stable nation, region, and a world. And finally, I'm proud to support H.Con.Res. 111, supporting the efforts of the United Bid Committee to bring the 2026 World Competition to Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Sports are an important way to increase cooperation and goodwill among nations and cultures. The FIFA World Cup is the biggest single sporting event competition in the world, and every 4 years the contest brings together 32 teams from 32 nations who compete on the pitch and inspire millions of viewers around the world. Hosting a World Cup in North America with our neighbors would be great for our economy and provide us an opportunity to showcase our hospitality alongside our neighbors to the north and south. And I'll add, of course, that Rhode Island would make an excellent location for the World Cup. We're known for, of course, our award-winning cuisine, our great oceans, our beautiful summer weather, and I know we'll compete in this as well. But I want to thank all my colleagues for the important measures that are brought before this committee, and yield back the balance of my time.
And the tomato sauce. Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And we go now to Dan Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak about two of today's bills, the No Assistance for Assad Act and the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act. With regard to the No Assistance for Assad Act, Assad alone is not responsible for the rampage upon his own country. Other nations such as North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China continue to lend a helping hand to Assad's reign of terror. The United Nations discovered that North Korea has been shipping chemical weapon components to Syria. Over 2,100 Iranian forces have died in the Syrian conflict. Russia's involvement in Syria is well known. and China has pledged $2 billion in construction and provided military support. The humanitarian effect of Assad's war on his own population is staggering. Physical reconstruction is estimated to cost in the range of $200 to $350 billion, but there is no amount of money that can heal the wounds Assad has inflicted. Meanwhile, the United States has spent a staggering $7.4 billion in Syria since 2011, and there is still no end in sight to the violence committed by this vile dictator. Assad, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China have significantly contributed to the death and destruction in Syria. They should be the ones paying to get Syria out of it. That's why I support the No Assistance for Assad Act, H.R. 4681, which places stringent conditions on U.S. assistance to Syrian reconstruction. Mr. Chairman, I also look forward to the day when the Iranian regime comes to the conclusion that its international terrorist activities and appalling violations of human rights is reprehensible. Until then, the United States must continue to apply maximum pressure, which is why I support the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act, H.R. 4744. The list of Iran's human rights abuses is too long for me to list in my brief statement. This bill, among other things, expresses the sense of Congress that the United States should, 1, deny the government Iran the ability to continue to oppress the people of Iran and to use violence and executions to silence pro-democracy protesters. 2, support efforts made by the people of Iran to promote the establishment of basic freedoms that build the foundation for the emergence of a freely elected, open, non-corrupt, and democratic political system. And 3, help the people of Iran produce, access, and share information freely and safely via the Internet and other media. I am proud to work on this bipartisan effort to stand with the people of Iran, with my fellow members of Congress, and the President. And I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Adriano Espiat from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Engel. Thank you for continuing the bipartisan work of this committee. I am a co-sponsor of all 4 bills before us today. I was an original co-sponsor of the House Resolution 644 to condemn slave auctions of migrants and refugees in Libya. Slavery is an ugly part of our history, and that's exactly where it should be, on the shelves of history books. CNN recently did an undercover report on the slave auctions outside of the Libyan capital of Tripoli. The footage sent a chilling down my spine, Mr. Chairman. These human beings are being referred to as merchandise and sold for a few $100s. This is horrible and wrong. The bill before us today is a good first step in condemning these slave auctions and expanding sanctions against those responsible for these slave auctions. It is my hope that the new Secretary of State will monitor this situation closely. H.R. 4681, also known as the No Assistance for Assad Act, will limit assistance for areas of Syria that are under Assad's control. Since 2011, more than 500,000 people have been killed and over 11 million have been displaced. Reconstruction could cost as much as $350 billion, but we need to ensure that any U.S. assistance comes with the assurance that the Assad regime will not get a hold of this money, that attacks against civilians cease immediately, that human rights abusers are removed from positions of authority. H.R. 4744, the Iran Human Rights and Hostage-Taking Accountability Act, will target questionable actors in Iran and aim to curb the litany of human rights atrocity. This bill explicitly details the United States government's support of the Iranian people, who for decades have faced a government that arrests, imprisons, and tortures political rivals. Additionally, this legislation condemns the Iranian government for taking U.S. hostages, a practice that is a direct violation of international law. One of the captive Americans, New York City native Robert Levinson, was detained in Kish Island in Iran for more than 11 years ago, making him the longest held hostage in U.S. history. On March 11, 2018, an Iranian spokesperson said Tehran has merely assumed a humanitarian role on this issue, repudiating past statements from Iranian officials pronouncing the country's willingness to actively aid the U.S. in locating Mr. Levinson. Considering the proposed sanctions in this bill, I urge the government of Iran and its leaders to cease all suppressive tactics targeting political dissidents, terminate all support of terrorist groups such as Hezbollah, and immediately return every U.S. citizen held hostage in custody in Iran. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the remaining part of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Espiat. We go to Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take the whole time. I do want to thank you and the committee for bringing up the No Assistance for Assad Act. Today's the 7th anniversary of the beginning of the war. Over 500,000 Syrians have been killed, including 50,000 children, by Assad and his Russian and Iranian backers. Those brutal regimes don't just target critical infrastructure like hospitals and schools with their artillery strikes, but the Assad regime continues to use chemical weapons, including chlorine gas, to kill his own citizens with impunity. We've seen too many images of young children gasping for their lives after a chemical weapon was dropped on them. The United States has provided more than $7.4 billion of humanitarian aid to the Syrian people since the beginning of the Syrian war. While the end of the conflict has yet to be determined, when the violence does end, we'll have an obligation to help the innocent people of Syria recover from the rampage of Bashar al-Assad. The No Assistance for Assad Act, which I proudly introduced with my colleagues, the chairman, the ranking member, and Mr. Boyle, would mandate that no early recovery funds be available to territories under control of the Assad government or for their associated forces, including Iran and Russia. They broke it, so as long as Assad's in power, they're going to own it. This legislation ensures that the United States will continue to provide early recovery and reconstruction aid to those areas free and democratic in Syria. This also requires 9 very clear, very tough conditions to be met for the president to release aid to restricted parts of Syria. As I've said before, in order to prevent the rise of the next generation of ISIS or terrorists, we must ensure that Bashar al-Assad is removed from power. I believe that the United States of America was put on earth to be an example of self-governance and order in a world that's drowning in strongmen, oppression, and poverty. Stopping Assad's genocide in Syria is part of our mission statement, and I'll continue to do what I can to support that mission. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the No Assistance for Assad Act, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll either yield or yield back.
Thank you, Adam. We'll go to, who else is seeking time? Mr. Castro, were you seeking time? No? Oh, Dina Titus of Nevada. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too support all 4 of the bills that are up today, and I thank the sponsors for bringing these important bills before us. I'm a co-sponsor of House Resolution 644, which strongly condemns the slave auctions and exploitation of migrants and refugees in Libya. Human trafficking has become a lucrative business in Libya, and the United States must do its part to condemn and stifle this industry. Human trafficking generates an estimated $150 billion a year in profits worldwide, so I'm glad to see that there are bipartisan efforts to combat this problem. My colleagues on this committee, Representatives Wagner, Bass, Smith, Frankel, and I, led a letter. We were joined by 80 other members of the House to the Appropriations Committee supporting strong funding for anti-trafficking programs at the Department of State and USAID. These programs protect marginalized communities that are especially vulnerable to labor and sexual trafficking, particularly migrants, women, and young people. The State Department's Trafficking in Persons report is a critical diplomatic tool that, when used appropriately, can expose abuses and contribute to significant improvements around the world. The Department's 2017 report found that in Libya, migrants, including potential trafficking victims, were arbitrarily detained for indefinite periods of time with no access to legal aid, and they were subjected to sexual violence, forced labor, and other human rights abuses. House Resolution 644 will send a strong message from our committee and from Congress that slave auctions and forced labor are absolutely unacceptable and that human rights of migrants and refugees demand the attention of the United States and the international community, and that's why I strongly support it. Second, House Continuing Resolution 111, which supports the efforts of the United Bid Committee to bring 2026 FIFA World Cup competition to Canada, Mexico, and the United States, and encourages the President to support this bid, reaffirms the strong trilateral relationship among our three countries. I serve as co-chair of the Travel and Tourism Caucus. We work to promote the travel and tourism industry and ensure that this vital sector of our economy continues to thrive because it plays an intrinsic role in the economy not only of the nation but of my district of Las Vegas. If the bid committee is selected to host the 2026 World Cup, Las Vegas, with 20 of the 30 largest hotels in the world, a new Raiders stadium, and a dedicated local fan base, will be in the running to be selected as one of the 12 cities to host games, and we look forward to that. Mexico and Canada are not just neighbors, but they are key allies, economic and security partners, and the United States' top tourist-generating countries. Unfortunately, we've seen a decrease in the arrival of Mexican visitors in 2017 compared to 2016, due in no small part to the rhetoric coming from the White House. North America's bid to host the 2026 World Cup would boost tourism and help foster the relationship among our three countries. At a time when the administration once again proposes a drastic 30% cut to the international affairs budget, these kinds of soft diplomatic initiatives can help reaffirm important relationships with our allies. So I strongly support this bill as well, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you. We go to Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Representative Kinzinger and Ranking Member Engel for their work on H.R. 4681, the No Assistance for Assad Act, as well as Chairman McCall and Ranking Member Deutsch for their work on H.R. 4744, and I support all the legislation. As a co-sponsor of these pieces of legislation, I believe that they are vitally important steps if we want to have any chance of a peaceful and stable future in the Middle East, or particularly in this region of the Middle East. As has been mentioned a number of times, today marks the 7th anniversary of the Syrian people's quest for democracy, and for the last 7 years, President Assad has committed monstrously brutal human rights crimes, and his barbarism has been sustained by both Tehran and Moscow. Tehran has been propping up Assad to bolster its influence in Syria, train its proxy forces, threaten Israel, and secure a so-called land bridge to the Mediterranean. In the interest of time, I will submit the rest of my statement for the record, and we'll just conclude by saying it's time that we use all mechanisms, all tools available to us to ensure that Tehran does not continue to undermine peace in the region. And I would strongly urge all my colleagues to support all these bills, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Any other members seeking time on the committee?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garrett of Virginia.
Mr. Chairman, I want to speak specifically and directly to the amendment in the nature of the substitute offered by Mr. Poe from Texas as it relates to H.R. 4744 and the capacity in which it outlines offenses against human rights and basic decency by the Iranian regime, and specifically point out that in, I believe, HJR 188 earlier passed this year, this body had the willingness to tell the truth as it relates to who the victims primarily, but not exclusively, were of the atrocities that occurred in Iran in and around 1988. And that is to point out the reality that the bulk of the victims of those offenses were affiliated with the MEK. And now there's pushback essentially on telling the truth from somewhere, perhaps on staff or externally, I don't know. But it's a dark damn day, sir, when this committee's not willing to tell the truth to the world. Now, let me be clear, Mr. Chairman, and again, my tone reflects no animosity towards any individual, but the idea that the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives of the United States would be afraid to acknowledge a reality because it might not be politically expedient as to who the victims of the atrocities committed by this horrific Iranian regime are and were. In my opinion, which I try to make clear as frequently and as loudly as I possibly can, is that just about any alternative on the ground as it relates to the governance of the nation of Iran is preferable to the status quo. But I don't have a preference as it relates to the MEK or their rival parties. I don't. So I'm not sitting here trying to curry favor with these amazing, brave people who show up in these yellow coats. I'm sitting here saying that it's an existential threat not only to the life of individuals who might have the temerity to protest conditions in Iran, but to the region and ultimately, if the JCPOA works out the way I think it will, to the world, to stand by and acknowledge this Iranian regime's malfeasance, but not all of it, but not the scope of it, but not with specificity. And so, I mean no ill will towards any in particular person, but we know what happened. It took us 10 years to figure it out. In 1988 in Iran, we know who the victims were, and we should address that with specificity because we're the House of Representatives of the United States of America, and if we're not willing to look the world in the eyes and tell them the truth, God knows who will. And so I don't know how much more vehement I could be in support of Mr. Poe's amendment. And this isn't about picking sides except for to say that the mullahs in Iran are dangerous to the world. And so I hope that members of this committee on both sides of the aisle will join me in acknowledging the total truth as it relates to the reality of what occurred in Iran these many years ago, because it's important that somebody in the world be willing to do what's right and not be afraid by political considerations. And it ought to be us. Thank you.
I'm going to thank the gentleman, but I'm going to recognize myself at this time. First and foremost, this bill sanctions senior Iranian officials for taking American hostages and for its human rights abuses against the Iranian people. The MEK is one of many groups that the Iranian regime has abused. There is no question that they have suffered very greatly. And that's why this bill, if you read the bill, and why Judge Poe's excellent amendment discusses in detail the 1988 massacre of tens of thousands of innocent people because of their political affiliations. But they're not the only ones massacred on an ongoing basis because of their political affiliations. It's not about one group. And it calls for an investigation of all of those massacred, including the MEK, calls for an investigation of all of those massacred and full accounting for the families of the victims. And it also discusses Iran's abuse of numerous other political dissidents and ethnic and religious minorities. And I think you and I both have plenty of examples of sitting with family of Baha'i or Zoroastrians, or you name the religion that has suffered over the past 4 decades, and why it calls for the Iranian regime to be held accountable. Now, with this bill, we are trying to speak directly to the Iranian people, to tell them that we stand in solidarity with them against their oppressive regime. If we start playing politics by naming certain parties and not others, we muddle this key message. So in the end, this is about more than one group. It is about the people of Iran. It is about their ongoing human rights abuses and taking concrete action to stop them. So again, I thank the gentleman. Any other members seek time? If not, hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on items considered en bloc. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the measures considered en bloc are agreed to. Without objection, the measures considered en bloc are ordered favorably reported as amended. Staff is directed to make any technical and conforming changes, and the Chair is authorized to seek House consideration under suspension of the rules. That concludes our business for today. I want to thank, of course, Ranking Member Engel, but also all of our committee members for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned.